it was only a matter of time in South Africa since we hear stories about the rand declining, the rand going to the shit hole, the rand weakening because of what Donald Trump has said. It was only a matter of time. And with this type of rand falling, it's different from a market collapse, but this is coming from just a threat from the United States president because the rand is trading in dollars. So I want you guys to hear something from a white man who's going to explain it, because you guys seem to get it more when it's a white man. White man exposing shocking news about this type of rand fall, this type of weakening of the rand. Because this is not any type of weakening of the rand. It's a special kind of weakening of the rand. And I want you guys to hear this because it's very interesting. Listen to this.
U.S. President Donald Trump's comment about cutting off funding to South Africa. This morning, the rand traded at 18 rand 89 cents against the U.S. dollar, about 1% weaker than its closing level on Friday. On Sunday, Trump said that certain classes of people in South Africa were being treated very badly, and he would suspend aid until the matter was investigated. Trump said South Africa was confiscating land. This after President Cyril Ramaphosa signed into law legislation that allows the state to expropriate land in the public interest under certain circumstances. Over the weekend, Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China, sending global currencies to multi-year lows. The rand was trading at 18 rand 92 cents to the dollar at midday. Let's broaden our discussion. We speak to Dr. Azar Jammine, who's a director and chief economist at Econometrics. For more, Dr. Jammine, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, we've witnessed this ripple effect following what we think is U.S. President Donald Trump's threats to South Africa's rand, stocks and bonds. What should we make of it?
You know, initially when I woke up this morning and saw the rand at 19 to the dollar, I said, wow, that was a massive reaction to the imposition of tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China by the United States. And then I suddenly heard a clip basically of Donald Trump berating the horrible situation in South Africa where land was being expropriated without compensation. And I said, oh, well, that explains why the rand tumbled. And soon after that, I then examined the situation more closely. And what did I find? That not only the rand, but the euro, the pound, the Mexican peso, the Canadian dollar, they had all tumbled first thing this morning in reaction to the imposition of those tariffs on the US's biggest three trading partners. And then I realized that it was not just Donald Trump's remarks about South Africa that had caused the rand to weaken so much. And this has been proved correct in the afternoon, where the dollar has given some of the ground that it gained, and the rand has recovered, you know, to trade somewhere between 1870 and 1880, way off its lows of 19 rand to the dollar. So yes, the Trump's comments on South Africa may have influenced the rand to some extent, but the main reason why the currency fell so sharply was because all currencies outside of other than the dollar tumbled on the basis that the US had imposed these very harsh tariffs on its neighbors and on China, and the negative implications that that will have for inflation and interest rates around the world. And when dollar interest rates are high, that tends to attract money into the US dollar, and that in turn means that emerging market currencies as a whole weaken. And the rand is a very highly traded emerging market currencies, and in such situations tends to weaken more than other currencies. Conversely, when the mood improves, it tends to improve faster than most other currencies.
Yeah, and of course all of this happens after a rate cut here in South Africa. I mean, what potential impact could this have on us as a country?
Well, I think there was a little bit of reassurance that following our rate cut, the day after the United States itself refused to cut rates, the rand held reasonably firm. It didn't weaken after the rate cut announcement, but quite clearly, if in this new environment of trade wars, where the fear is of higher inflation around the world and the resultant need to keep interest rates higher than might otherwise have been the case, this is bad news for emerging market currencies and for monetary policy in emerging markets. It limits, without a doubt, it limits the capacity of the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates any further. We are fortunate that our inflation rate has fallen very sharply and by more than expected and is down at 3% at present, and that means that the Reserve Bank is under no obligation to raise interest rates right now, but it will be very reluctant to cut them in the short term any further, given what's just happened. And Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago hinted at that last week in his monetary policy statement.
With the US being one of South Africa's most significant trade partners, what impact could we see on South African business?
It's a good question because there's two ways to look at it. The one is on the trade side, the other is on the investment front. Well, if we were to retaliate the way our Minister of Mineral Affairs, Gwede Mantashe, called on us to do and to ban exports of minerals to the US, well, we would lose very badly. But I think the negative effect is more on investor sentiment and the increased reluctance on the part of American investors to want to invest in South African government bonds, first and foremost, and secondly, to invest in the country in productive activity. Our bond yields, for example, this morning shot up by 25 basis points, by 0.25%, and that overnight means that government has to pay more in order to fund the shortfall between what it spends and what it receives in taxes, and which it has to borrow. Now it has to borrow at a rate 0.25% higher from overseas than would otherwise have been the case. And that costs us money. It costs, in the region of hundreds, translates into hundreds of millions of rands.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for weighing in on this conversation and giving us that perspective.
Retaliate the way our Minister of Mineral Affairs, Gwede Mantashe, called on us to do and to ban exports of minerals to the US, well, we would lose very badly. But I think the negative effect is more on investor sentiment and the increased reluctance on the part of American investors to want to invest in South African government bonds, first and foremost, and secondly, to invest in the country in productive activity. Our bond yields, for example, this morning shot up by 25 basis points, by 0.25%, and that overnight means that government has to pay more in order to fund the shortfall between what it spends and what it receives in taxes, and which it has to borrow. Now it has to borrow at a rate 0.25% higher from overseas than would otherwise have been the case. And that costs us money. It costs, in the region of hundreds, translates into hundreds of millions of rands.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for weighing in on this conversation and giving us that perspective.